Good evening. Good evening. This is Minister Kevin Hudson standing in the gap for our pastor, Pastor Maurice Coffey, and he also giving honor to our co-pastor, Pastor Lex Coffey. Listen, we are so excited to be with you this evening. This evening is going to be heavy tonight. It's going to be good, but there's going to be a lot of substance tonight as it relates to grief recovery. We are in the third week of our 4-week installment of grief recovery. And tonight we're going to get into some meaty stuff as it relates to grief recovery. So listen, we want to thank all of you who have joined us this evening, our Union Community Church family, all of our friends and churches that are around the city, around the nation that is looking in tonight. Thank you for taking some time on this beautiful day in Cleveland to spend some time to listen in tonight for our discussion on grief recovery. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to tonight. So buckle up. We're going to get a bit deep tonight, and we're just looking forward to having this discussion. As we go to our next slide, we're going to look at the components of grief recovery. And as you can see on the screen, you'll be able to look at for week 3, May 20th. Let me give you the agenda for our discussion tonight. The first thing that we're going to do is that we're going to look at creating a lost history graph of your losses and of your grieving events. We're going to also walk you through tonight creating a relationship graph to one of your grieving events. Then we're also going to review my lost history graph, and we're going to actually review one of my relationship graphs of a grieving event. And we're going to talk about how to select a partner to read your graph. So tonight, you've learned about grief recovery, but now tonight we're going to get into how do you document your grief? How do you document the losses that you've had in your life? Tonight is when we start doing the work. We've been building it for the last 2 weeks, but tonight starts the work of now sitting down and graphing out your losses, your grieving events, and to start the process to writing that completion letter. You can look here in week 4. Next week, we're going to conclude this discussion, this Bible study on grief recovery. And as you can see here on your screen, next week, we're going to talk about writing a completion letter to the pain associated with the losses and the grieving events that you've had in your life. We're going to talk about how to select a partner that you're going to read this letter to. We're going to talk about the process of discarding the letter, and then we're going to talk about seeking help and resources. So the next 2 weeks are going to be a bit heavy. This is where we get into the meat of grief recovery. This is where we get into documenting and how to process it and how to say goodbye to the pain associated with it. So just stay with us tonight. But we're going to spend the first couple of minutes doing a recap over our last few weeks. We'll just do a brief recap. We won't get too deep into it. But those of you that may have just been joining us and maybe you didn't get a chance to join us for the last 2 weeks, or maybe you missed the first week, we'll also do a quick recap of the last few weeks just to keep you up to date on what we're doing. Let us talk about week 1 recap in terms of what we covered during our first week. As you know, we talked about what is grief. You know by now that grief is conflicting feelings caused by the end of or change in a familiar pattern of behavior. We talked about what is recovery. Recovery is taking action properly to process your grief and your losses. And tonight is going to be the first night that we're going to really get in to how do you take action towards properly grieving your losses. We also talked about in week 1, why is grief recovery so important? We talked about your health. We talked about minimizing the impact on future relationships, how to better reflect Christ, and just making better decisions. You've heard it week 1, you've heard it week 2, now you're going to hear it again tonight. When your heart is broken, your head doesn't work. So we want to make sure that that's why grief recovery is so important for us. And last week, we learned that grief recovery is not just about death. It can be any life event that you're grieving, any change in a familiar pattern or behavior. That can be grief. It can be COVID-19. It can be divorce. It can be a job loss. It can be finances. Grief is grief. And we learned that it can be any event that has been painful in your life that you are grieving. So that was kind of week 1. let's get into week 2 recap. So last week, we talked about the do's and the don'ts in helping others dealing with grief. Some of the don'ts that we talked about last week in terms of helping others deal with grief is, I know how you feel and I understand what you're going through. We talked about these are some of the don'ts. And we learned last week that it's not good to tell someone, I know how you feel and I understand what you're going through. Because grief is grief, and we never know how they are processing grief. Always remember, how we process grief is oftentimes different than how other people process grief. So we want to just be careful, even if we experience something that's similar. Even if you lost a spouse or you lost a pet and someone else lost a spouse or lost a pet, we still want to be careful and saying to people, oh, I know how you feel, I understand, because we really don't know how they are processing that grief, and we want to make sure that we're careful with that. We talked about be careful saying to others, it will be okay. We want to be careful saying to people, well, just give it time. We want to be careful saying to people, be strong, don't cry, because we don't want people to minimize their grief. We don't want people to feel that if I cry, that's not good. So we want to be careful saying some of these things to people who are dealing with grief. We talked about not saying things like, well, it could be worse, where they weren't good for you anyway, right? You'll find another job or person or house, because we learned last week that when we say these things, and we have the right intentions, we just didn't know, right? And that's why we're doing this grief recovery Bible study over these last several weeks. It's just to educate all of us to how do we not only process grief for ourselves, how do we deal with losses and grieving events in our own life, but more importantly, how do we come alongside someone and to help them grieve? So that's the reason why some of you may have had good intentions. Don't feel bad if you said some of these things. We don't want you to feel bad. You didn't know. So that's why tonight we want to help educate you and let you know these are some things that you don't want to say, because it sends the wrong message. Our intentions is one thing, but oftentimes how people receive that is totally different. And we also want to be careful saying to people, don't feel bad. Because going through grief recovery and someone is processing a loss or a grieving event, it's nothing wrong with feeling bad, right? There's nothing wrong with feeling sad. So that's the reason why we want to just be careful in these don'ts, because oftentimes the opposite is what they're receiving. Amen? So let's go to also some of the do's. These are some things that people that are dealing with grief, these are some things that you want to do. Do a lot of it when you can. Some of that is being a heart with ears. Sometimes the best grief, the best way to come alongside and support someone is just being a heart with ears, just listening. Let them cry. Let them vent. Let them be upset. Let them be sad. You don't have to counsel them. You don't have to give them advice. Sometimes the best thing that they need is someone just to sit with them and just let them grieve and let them be in their moment. Let them process that pain. So that's something that you can always do that. Also, you can pray with their permission. We want to always respect and understand that although all of us have a heart, that everyone comes to Christ. Sometimes you may be having to deal with someone who's grieving, and maybe they don't know the Lord. Maybe Christianity is not their religion. You just never know. So we want to make sure that we are careful with when we just say to someone, let me pray with you. The best thing to do is just say to them, hey, is this a good time to pray? Get their permission to make sure that they are in the spirit to receive that. Some other things that you want to do for people who are dealing with grief is allow them to process grief in their own way. Let's be careful not to judge people if they're dealing with a loss or a grieving event in their life, and maybe they're not processing it the way that we think that they should. Let's be careful not to judge them. Let's allow them to process grief in their own way. It may not look like the way you would process that grief or that particular loss, but grief is grief, and let people allow them to process that. Also, you want to encourage them at the right time to seek help, to seek a counselor, to get support. Encourage them to do that, because we've learned through this teaching that there are some myths to grief recovery, and it's not just about it'll get better with time. It'll get better when you take the right steps to properly process that grief. I'm so excited because tonight we're going to learn about 2 major steps in the grief recovery process, which is writing that lost history graph and writing a relationship graph. These are two major steps that you want to take to properly process your grief and start that road to healing. And last thing, where it says some of the do's that you want to come alongside people and support, is that you want to check in on them. Sometimes a simple text message, an email, an in-mail, whatever it may be, just to check on them, saying, hey, how are you doing? Just want to say hi, hello. If you need me, I'm here. So these are some of the do's that we learned last week in terms of helping people deal with grief. The next slide that we're going to go to is talk about some of the myths. We did this last week. We talked about the myths to grief recovery, that there's an endpoint. We want to be careful. That's a myth. There's necessarily no endpoint to grief. Remember, grief recovery is being able to say goodbye to the pain associated with the event, but it doesn't mean that there's an endpoint. Time heals all wounds. Remember, that's a myth. You can be hurt. You can be dealing with an event 30 years, and if you don't take the steps to properly process that loss and that grieving event, you can still be hurting and unhealthy and have incomplete grief inside. And you know what happens when it's inside. Unbeknownst, hurting people, they do what? They hurt people. And it's not their intention, but we want to make sure that we complete and help you deal and heal with some of the grief that you have. Some of the other myths, we won't go through all of them because of time tonight. Some of the other ones is the goal of grief is to get over it or move on. That's not the goal of grief. Listen, there are some people who may have lost a pet 10 years ago, lost a spouse, lost a loved one, and they can still feel that pain just like it was yesterday. But doesn't mean that they have not processed that grief in a healthy way. So we want to make sure that the goal of grief is not to get over it or to move on. The goal of grief recovery is just to heal from the pain associated with that event. Some of the other areas of other myths to grief recovery is that there needs to be a reconnection of their relationship. This is so important. Let me just park here for a minute. When you go through grief recovery, when you have to forgive someone who betrayed you, someone who they broke your trust, they broke confidentiality, they hurt you, it could have been an affair, infidelity, whatever it may be, you can grieve that loss of a relationship. You can grieve that pain. You can go through proper grief recovery to be able to say goodbye to the pain associated with that loss or that unforgiveness. But just because you go through grief recovery, it doesn't mean that there's a reconnection of the relationship. There's a myth that people feel like, well, if I forgive that person or if I get to a better place, does that mean that we have to reconnect and get back together? Then the answer is no. Forgiveness and grief recovery does not always mean reconnection of the relationship. Amen? So we just want to make sure that these are just some of the myths to grief recovery. We want to make sure that you are well informed and you are educated about this. And lastly, from last week, we want to cover it. Remember, we talked about some STERBs. You can see here right on the screen, STERBs, STERBS, are short-term energy release behaviors. And we learned from these STERBs that these are habits that oftentimes people do to cope with the grief. So oftentimes, instead of going through grief recovery in the process, a lot of times people develop some of these habits, and these habits, they become unhealthy and they deal with them. So just be careful if you know someone or yourself, if you're dealing with some of these unhealthy habits, whether it's food or alcohol or drugs or whatever it may be, if you're using something as a short-term release to cope, just be careful in that and seek some help so you can properly deal with the grief. We don't want you to develop unhealthy habits to cope, because we know here, as we see on the screen, that we want to watch your thoughts before they become words. Watch your words before they become actions. Watch your actions before they become habits. Watch your habits before they become character. Watch your character before it becomes your destiny. So we want to be careful that we're not developing unhealthy habits to cope with our grief. Amen. So now we're going to get into the meat of it tonight, we're going to talk about developing a lost history graph. Listen, get something to write with, get a notepad, because you don't want to miss these next few slides that we're going to get into. Now that you've processed your grief, you learned about what grief is, you learned about what grief isn't. Man, you learned about how to help people with grief and how not to help people with grief. Man, you learned about some myths to grief recovery. You learned about not developing unhealthy habits. Now the work begins. Now you say, listen, Rev Kev, now what do we do that we are in this place? How do we start the process? The first thing that you do is you develop something that's called a lost history graph. I'm not going to rush through this because I know many of you are taking notes. And tonight I'm asking you all who are watching this broadcast that we want you to do the homework. We want you over the next week, before next Wednesday, we want you to take some time and to do your lost history graph, because next week we're going to build upon that and talk about how do you write a letter to that graph. So let me just walk through what a lost history graph is. As you can see here on the screen, those of you, the primary purpose of this exercise is to create a detailed examination of the sad, painful, and negative loss and grieving events in your life. You may experience a wide range of emotions in completing this graph. Listen, this is okay. If you have an emotional reaction to writing this, let it be okay. But what you want to do is that you want to get a pen and paper to get and sit down to do that. So let's go to the next slide, lost history graph. So let me give you the instructions as to how you start this lost history graph. The first thing you want to do is plan time to sit alone, where you can be by yourself. Some of you may not need that, but many of us, we think better, we process better when we are alone. Get in a place that's safe. It allows you to process and to breathe, because you're going to want some time alone to do this, many of you. After you do that, plan for about 2 hours. It's going to take about 2 hours because you don't want to rush through this process. Bring a notepad, a pen and paper, and bring a tissue box, because this may be an emotional process for many of you. So what you want to do is this. So now that you can visualize your place as to where you are going to sit alone for 1 to 2 hours and to be prepared to put together your lost history graph, you can see here on the screen what you're going to do. You're going to write down the most sad, negative, and painful loss events that you can remember, along with the year, approximate year that it happened. So just imagine yourself with a long sheet of paper. You can do it on a poster, you can do it on a notepad, you can do it on your computer, you can do it anywhere where you're comfortable, but you want to document and write this information down. You may be asking, well, what are some of the types of negative loss events that we should be writing down that were losses in our life? Let me just give you a few of them. Maybe you went through a divorce in 1997, in 2011. So you would write that down on your sheet of paper, and you would just write divorce 2011. If that was a sad and painful and negative event in your life, if that was a loss, if that was a grieving event, so you would just write that down. You will want to start to the earliest point that you can remember in your life. So oftentimes what is a good practice is on your lost history graph, the first thing you want to do is write down your birth year. And you will see mine's 1970. And then what I did is that, and I'm going to show you a little bit later in our discussion tonight, is that you want to then start to journey back and write down what were some of the most sad, negative, and painful events that you experienced, where you experienced a loss. It was a grieving event. And I'm going to actually walk you through my lost history graph tonight. So things are like divorce, maybe death of a person or a pet, a breakup, or a change of a relationship. It can be a best friend, a sibling, maybe kids, finances. Some of you may have, in 2008, you had a repossession. Maybe you had a foreclosure in 2014. Maybe you filed bankruptcy in 2002. These are negative, sad, painful life events that you want to write down on your graph. Maybe you moved. Maybe you changed homes. You changed schools. Some of us, that was painful. Some of you, maybe it wasn't. You want to think about what was sad, negative, or painful to you. And you want to write down the approximate year that these things happen. A couple other ones just to help you with this letter is maybe your health. Maybe you may have had a diagnosis. Maybe you had a loss of mobility. Maybe in 2009, the doctor maybe told you something that you had something that now that represented a loss. So you, on your sheet of paper, you want to just write down whatever that health scare was or that health diagnosis and just write down the year. All you're doing is just writing down, like in a bullet point format, what was the loss or grieving event, and then right next to it, what was the approximate year. The goal is that you're going to be looking at a sheet of paper or looking on your iPad or looking on your laptop or whatever platform you want to use to record this. But you're going to be looking at a series of events on this sheet of paper with a year next to it. This is called your lost history graph. Again, you want to start out from when your birth year and just try to journey back as best as you can and start to just record some of these painful events from when you were born until now that you may have experienced. Listen, this is going to be homework for you if you can. If you can, try to do this by next Wednesday, because next Wednesday we're going to take one of those events and we're going to call and do something called a relationship graph. Let me go to the next slide. So let me first talk to you about my lost history graph, because I always like when I teach this and when I talk with people about grief recovery, I like to make sure that I'm clear and I'm giving clarity. And I always like to give examples, because someone can say something to you, but it's nothing like seeing something visual. So those of you that can see us on Facebook Live or on Zoom, hopefully you can see what's on the screen. But what you're looking at now is kind of a modified lost history graph for me. I could have put more losses on here, but for the purpose of tonight, I wanted just to give you kind of a high-level overview of what this lost history graph looks like, just to get you started on your way. So look at my lost history graph as you can see this online. So I was born in 1970. Yes, I'm turning 50 this year. Amen. Thank you, Jesus. But in 1978, I lost my best friend. That was a grieving event. In 1979, I lost a pet. That was a grieving event. That was a loss for me. 1980, I moved homes, and it wasn't under great circumstances. That was a painful event in my life. In 1988, I left my high school basketball team. That was a painful event. Remember what grief is. Grief is conflicting feelings for an event that has been different. It is a change in a familiar pattern or behavior. So for me, that leaving the high school basketball team in 1988, I had to grieve that, because that was a change in a familiar pattern, and I had to grieve that. Pledging to fraternity in 1989, you can see here on my shirt, I pledged Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity. But in 89, when I pledged, that was a grieving event. You may be saying, how was that a grieving event for you? Wasn't it fun? No, because I pledged for a year and I lost some freedom during that year. That was a tough year for me. It was my first year in college. I pledged for a long time and I lost a lot of freedom. That was difficult. Remember, grief is conflicting feelings. So you can feel great about something, but also sad at the same time. Just like those people that may experience a loss or a death from someone that may have been suffering. Conflicting feelings. You're happy that they're not suffering anymore, but you're sad that they're gone, right? So for me, there was some conflicting feelings with grief. In 2002, I went through a divorce. That was a painful event in my life. In 2004, I had a loss of finances and credit. That was a painful event in my life. 2008, I had lost a relationship with a sibling. We had a broken relationship, and that was a loss. That was a painful event in my life when my sibling and we just had a broken relationship. That was difficult. In 2015, I had a broken relationship with a child, and that was hard. So as you can see, I could have put more on here, but hopefully you guys see on the screen my lost history graph. Man, I could have added 10 more things, but in the spirit of time, I didn't want to add all of that. But I wanted just to show you this is what your lost history graph should look like. And I want you to journey back. That's why I'm saying is that when I did this, it brought up some memories. And some of you may be saying, well, I'm not sure I want to do a lost history graph. I'm not sure I want to remember and journey back and think about some of those painful areas. That's probably why you want to do it. Because what we want to do is that we want to start the process. You see, sometimes we don't want to journey back to some painful events in our life because oftentimes we haven't completed and we haven't healed from it. We haven't said goodbye to the pain associated with those events. We have not properly processed the grief. So if you have something from 20 years ago that you think, oh, I don't want to think about that. Why are you telling me to think about that? If it's still hurting you, and if there's still a lot of pain there, this is the reason why you should do it. Because you're going to learn over the next 2 weeks the process to properly grieve that loss. So when you think about it, the pain associated with that loss is no longer there. So that's why you want to do a lost history graph. Take your time. Even in preparing for tonight, I had to take my time because the reality is that some of these losses I'm still processing and getting healed from. So that's the lost history graph. So please, if you can, try to complete this by next Wednesday, because now after you complete a lost history graph, the next thing that you have to do that on the next screen is called the relationship graph. So your lost history graph is looking at all of your losses that were major since your birth year. The relationship graph is where you're going to just now look at creating a relationship of just one of those events. So let's look at the definition of a relationship graph. The primary purpose of this exercise is to create a detailed examination of one loss or grieving event. Again, you may experience a wide range of emotions in completing this graph. This is okay. If you have an emotional reaction, let it be okay with you. So now that you've completed your lost history graph, put that aside, and then now you want to spend some other time alone and plan about 1 to 2 hours, and you want to get another clean sheet of paper out, get a clean screen on your laptop or whatever you're going to use to record, and now you're going to do a relationship graph. Well, what is a relationship graph? You can see the instructions on the screen. It's where you identify one grieving event that you want to examine. So the lost history graph, as you saw, listed all of your grieving and your losses as far back as you can remember. Now you want to do a relationship graph ultimately to each of those losses. But we're going to ask you just to pick one for a relationship graph. You want to make a list of all of the positive experience with that event. And I'm going to show you tonight my relationship graph. So of all my loss history graphs, some of the losses that I talked to you about this evening, I took one of those grieving events, and now I'm going to do a relationship graph to one of those events. And I'll walk you through that when we get to the next slide. But when you take one of those events from your loss history graph, now what you want to do is write down all of the positive experiences with that grieving event. And then you want to write down all of the major sad, painful, and negative experiences with that grieving event. Let's go to the next slide so I can show you what this looks like. As you can see here on the screen, so of all the loss history graph that I showed you here a few minutes ago, I picked one that I want to unpack, and this is my relationship graph. See, what happened is that as we look at all the losses and the grieving events in our life, at the end of the day, for us to process that grief, we need a relationship with each of those events where we look at some of the positives and the negatives of that event. So what I did is that, as you can see here on the screen, I'm going to select one event. The one event that I'm going to select was the relationship with my child in 2015. If you remember a few minutes ago, that was one of the events that was on my loss history graphs. So in 2015, I had a broken relationship with my oldest son in 2015. And that was a loss. That was a grieving event for me. And I want to talk about it this evening because I want to journey this with you. I want to show you what this process looks like and tell you about where we're at today and how I was able to properly grieve this. So you can do a grief recovery on someone that's even living or if someone is not living. So let me tell you about some of the positive experiences that I had with my child. AAU basketball, man, you know, that was positive. Throughout his childhood, man, we traveled all around the United States and we stayed in hotels, and that was just a positive experience. We were able to stay together. We went out with his teammates, and we did this years throughout him coming up. Man, that was just a positive experience with my son. Something else was basketball at his school. Man, that was a positive experience. He was a great basketball player. I went to almost all of his games, and he was a star on the team, and it was awesome. It was great to be a part of seeing him because I played basketball coming up, and I played college basketball. I've coached basketball. I love it. So to see my son, who was excelling in basketball, going to the games, I was involved with the coaching staff. It was great. That was a positive experience in my life with my son was basketball. Also soccer. Man, I remember that I was involved in coaching soccer when he was younger. That was a positive experience because he was good in soccer and I was able to coach. So it's always great that when you can not just be a spectator, but when you can also be a part of the coaching staff. That's not for everybody, but for me, it was great to see him excel at soccer and coach. That was a positive experience. We had a lot of fun together. We laughed. That was just great. His baptism. You know, I was there when he was baptized, when he gave his life to Christ. Man, when he went down in the water, that was a positive experience to seeing your child get baptized and to give their life to Christ. That was positive. His academics, oh man, he did great throughout his middle school, elementary, high school. He did great in his academics. That was a positive experience to get honor roll and all of the things that he earned academically. He was born again, and also he was ranked. He was ranked one of the best guards in basketball. So I could have went on and on, but I want you to show that with a relationship graph, you want to pick one event from your lost history graph, and now you want to do a relationship graph where you pick that one event and you write down what are all the positive things that came out of that grieving event. Because even though we may have had losses in our life, even though we've had some grieving and we've had some painful events, it doesn't mean there weren't positive experiences associated with some of those events. And we want to make sure that we remember those so we can have a balanced view of how to properly process the grief. So those are positive experiences. Let me go to the next slide and talk about some of the negative experiences that I've dealt with my child, my oldest one. School administrator and teacher relationships. That was hard. Even though he had good academics, he played basketball, his behavior was challenging to teachers. So that was not a great experience for me as a parent. All throughout his school is having to deal and going up to the school, taking time off work, talking to the teachers, him getting disciplined. That was painful. That was painful. His last month of high school, he wasn't able to attend. He graduated high school, but because of a behavior event, he had to finish school from home. That was painful. That was a negative experience with my child. His first year in college, he got great grades. He had graduated magna cum laude from his high school, and then his first year in college, he didn't do well. He didn't do well. His grades suffered and got into some things that he shouldn't have gotten to, and got involved in some things he shouldn't have gotten involved in. You also see here that he had some drug use and some drug rehab when he was his first year in college. Those were negative experiences that he had in his life. He had to go to drug rehab twice. That was hard. And there was some stealing that was involved. These were some negative experiences that he had in his life. These led up. Now you want to know, why was this on my lost history graph? Why was this a grieving event? Because the person that I had a relationship, the person who I thought my son was all throughout high school and getting good grades, I never would have expected for his first year for him to essentially flunk out of his first year of college and to resort to the drug use and to get to a place where he had to go to drug rehab. And stealing was involved. That put a strain, as you can imagine, on our relationship. He had to go out of state for therapy twice, and it was hard. It was hard. The person that I had a relationship with, the texture of that relationship shifted mightily. Why was this a grieving event? Because it was a change in a familiar pattern or behavior of our relationship. I had to grieve that, and I did. So I want to just walk you through, this is the process that you want to go through when you're doing that. So number one, you're going to do your loss history graph, where you're going to document all your losses with the approximate year. And then you're going to take one of those grieving events and you're going to do what I did. You're going to write down all of the positive experience with that one loss, and you're going to write down all of the negative experiences. So now let me walk you through what I did. I went to see a grief recovery counselor. For 10 weeks, they made me do a loss history graph, and then I sat down with a grief counselor, and they made me do a relationship graph. You know, the relationship graph I did was on my son. And they had me talk through the positive experiences. They had me talk through the negative experiences. And then they had me to process that, to talk through it. And ultimately, it ended with me writing a completion letter to the pain associated with that grieving event. And I can tell you that it helped me internally. It helped me to accept him for the place he was at. It helped me to love him better. It helped me to not hold a grudge or be disappointed because he wasn't at the place that I wanted him to be. And it helped me to just come alongside and love him. What I didn't realize that he was grieving as well. He was dealing with STIRBs, short-term energy releasing behaviors. He had developed unhealthy habits to cope with some of the losses and the grieving that he had. You see, he went through college, and all through high school, he was the man. He was a star basketball player. All the spotlight was on him all through high school. He went to college, and that was no longer the case. Everyone on the team was at his level or higher. He didn't get a starting position. He didn't even get that much playing time. And basketball, man, that was his destiny. Even though he was smart academically, he had a desire to go play pro ball. So when he went to college and had to sit on the bench and play 0 minutes after being a star all these years, he grieved that. That was a loss. And what he did, he developed some unhealthy habits to cope with his pain. And those habits at that point became his character. And it almost took him out and became his destiny. But thank God that he was able to go to drug rehab. He went once. He came back home to Cleveland for about a year. Then he had to go back to rehab. And I can thank God today. And as he was in rehab, they helped him deal with the grief. They helped him deal with the pain. They helped him properly process the loss that he had. And now he's much healthier. He is working. Our relationship has never been better. We talk every day. We do weekly devotions with one another. He's 22. He's found his calling. He's a phenomenal cook. He's going to pursue a career in culinary arts. He's rededicating his life to Christ, and our relationship has never been better. Thank God that God restored it. But he had to go through grief recovery, and I had to. We had to properly process our grief. Thank God that God kept me. Thank God that I didn't develop an unhealthy habit to cope, because for a good 3 years, our relationship was strained. We barely talked. He was in jail, and he went through a lot. But God turned his life around. With Jesus and therapy, he's in a much better place. So I wanted to be transparent with you this evening because grief recovery is so important. If I had not went through grief recovery myself, I probably could not have accepted him. I probably would have stayed disappointed, upset that he's not out of college right now. And I couldn't come alongside and love him with the love of Christ. He would have seen anger on me and unforgiveness while I'm telling everyone that I'm a man of God. Remember, God is a God of love and forgiveness. And if I wouldn't have properly grieved that loss in our relationship, that change, then my son would not have seen the love of God on me. He would have heard me talking about how I'm a minister, but he wouldn't have been able to experience the love of God and the unforgiveness. I feel like he was the prodigal son, that he went out wild partying and doing his thing, and when he came back, I wanted to embrace him with open arms. The only reason why I was able to embrace him with open arms at that story in the prodigal son is because I went through grief recovery. I properly grieved that loss. So I was able to receive him no matter what condition he came back. So hopefully that you learned tonight. So next week, as we get ready to wrap this up, I want you to do a lost history graph. I want you to do a relationship graph and pick one event. Hopefully my examples has given you a visual of what that looks like. And next week, you don't want to miss next week, because I'm going to help you write a completion letter to the pain associated with that event. The event with my son happened. I can't forget that it happened, but the pain associated with that time in our life is gone. So I praise God for that. As I end with a scripture, I want to take you to Psalms 147, verse 3 in the NIT. Psalms 147, verse 3 reads this: He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. When I took some time to look into the commentary, to look into the Hebrew meaning of these words, heal in Hebrew means to heal, to make healthful. Brokenhearted means in the Hebrew to break in pieces, to be broken. Binds in Hebrew means to tie, to bind up, to restrain, to bandage. And wounds means in Hebrew pain, hurt, sorrow, and injury. So when you read that scripture, he heals. He heals. He, Jesus Christ, heals. To heal, to make healthful. Jesus heals the brokenhearted. The brokenhearted, those of us who our heart has been broken in pieces. It's been broken. And he binds to tie up, to bind up, to bandage up our wounds, meaning our hurt, our pain, and our sorrow. Listen, we're so glad that you joined us this evening. Listen, we thank God for our pastoral staff to let us talk about grief recovery. I know you want to get back to being empowered by the word of God, but listen, healing comes with Jesus and therapy. And I want you to know that they work together. I'm so glad that you joined us this evening. Listen, join us next week. We're going to end this Bible study on grief recovery, and we're going to talk about how to take that relationship graph and how to write a completion letter to that pain. We're going to talk about how to select a partner that you're going to read this to. And we're going to talk about a process that you can now do a relationship graph to all the pain on your lost history graph. And I'm going to show you how to write a letter to all the pain on your lost history graph. You may have to do it over time. It may take you 6 months. It may take you a year. You may just do one letter a month or one a quarter. It's up to you. But next week, we're going to end this grief recovery training. Man, we hope that you enjoy yourself. Thank you for peeking in to our Bible study and learning how to properly process those painful, those negative, those sad events that you've grieved with. Why? Because we want you to reflect Christ. We want people to see Christ on you. Sometimes we are the only Bible that people read. Our life is sometimes the only Bible that people read. And we want to make sure that we're healthy on the inside. We want to make sure that there are no barriers internally that's keeping us from displaying the love of God. That's why we're here. That's why we're talking about grief recovery. Because ultimately, we want God to get the glory. We want someone to see our life and say, in spite of all the losses and the grieving events that we've gone through, that we are still treating them with the love of God. We're still treating them with the love of Christ. And that maybe, just maybe, they ask you, how are you able to do that? And to give us an opportunity to witness and tell them it was grief recovery and Jesus Christ. Listen, I'll see you next week. Thank you again for joining. Enjoy the rest of this beautiful evening. If you have any questions, feel free to make a comment in our Facebook page if you need me to answer any questions that you may have. Listen, as our pastor says, we love you, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. Until next week, we'll see you.